Merci. Sorry for being late, and I apologize also on behalf of the ambassador, who was, of course, supposed to introduce this meeting, but his plane has been delayed. He's on his way. He will join us shortly. Thanks to all of you for being here. Thanks to you, dear Anne Applebaum and Franklin FOER, for coming, joining this Jean Monnet Conversation. As you know, Jean Monnet Conversations are a series of discussions that we're organizing in partnership with the Atlantic in order to address geopolitical subjects at the heart of the transatlantic relationship. Today we'll talk about Ukraine, which is of course a very hot topic. And a few days after the state visit of President Macron here in the United States, I will not surprise you if I tell you that, of course, Ukraine was on the top of the agenda of the president in his discussions with President Biden and also with congressmen and congresswomen. So Ukraine has been addressed at length, as you probably saw also in the press conference and the various words of our president when he was on the American soil. I will be brief because I don't want to make you wait too long. Of course, the situation in Ukraine remains worrying. The numerous Russian bombardments of civilian installations depriving the populations of electricity while winter has now set in constitutes an unforgivable crime on the part of the Russian invader and cannot go unpunished. I would therefore reiterate France's commitment for the Ukrainian populations and recall that we will host on December 13th in Paris an international conference on this very support for civilians facing the consequences of the war in Ukraine. That's number one. Number two, I want also to emphasize that those responsible for war crimes will be held accountable and that France actively contributes to the collection of evidence and the establishment of penal responsibility on the legal part. While France and the EU will maintain their unfailing aid to Ukraine, a point on which President Macron insisted when he came here and spoke with President Biden is to help Ukraine to resist and to ensure that the country is fully restored to its rights. And this is an important point. The president also mentioned and alluded to the need to reflect on the post-conflict period. You probably see that as well. Once the war is over, it will be necessary to find the condition for a lasting peace in Europe, a new security architecture which will make it possible to avoid future wars, which is easier said than done, of course. I will now give the floor to our two keynote speakers and partners from the Atlantic to launch this discussion, and in particular to Anne Applebaum, who's visiting us in Washington and who we are happy to welcome. Thank you.
Let's have a conversation about Ukraine. So we're at this moment. I think we've gone through 3 chapters in the war. We had the battle for Kyiv, where independent Ukraine clearly emerged as a fact on the ground that was not going to be erased. You have the stalemate over the summer, and then you have the astonishing success of the counteroffensive in the late summer and the fall. And we're on the cusp of this next chapter in the war. So at this stage, what gives you the most agita about the future of Ukraine? What anxieties do you carry for the country? And what's your level of optimism as we enter this next phase?
Thank you, Frank, for those very easy questions. Wait a second. Yes, thank you for those easy questions.
Well, because I've been told that every question you've had, you've been asked before, so.
I was joking. I mean, the thing that worries me the most about Ukraine is the thing that that our French colleague said just before we started, which is the attack on the Ukrainian infrastructure and the ways in which that could both damage and undermine the Ukrainian economy, but could also begin to make people in Europe feel that this isn't something that can be won. And in that sense, it could be part of a campaign to pressure Ukraine to negotiate too early. So one of my deep convictions about the war is that it will only end, meaning end for good. So there won't be a ceasefire and then they start fighting again, or there won't be the Russians rearm and attack again next year. The only way it ends for good is if it ends with a clear sense of Ukrainian victory and Russian defeat, and if Russia understands that. And they don't have to say it that way or put it that way, but there has to be some understanding in Moscow that the war was a mistake.
Right.
And if the war is a mistake, then they won't want to do it again. And so therefore, I think that the Ukrainians need to gain back, at the very least, the territory they've lost since February. And then there could be some conversation. But what you're beginning to hear, and you heard it a little bit during President Macron's visit, although it was more sotto voce, but certainly in the American press, certainly you hear it in Europe, you hear this, this kind of mantra, why aren't we negotiating? The
band's all together. Welcome, Ambassador.
Sorry. Let's continue.
So, no, Anne is in the middle of describing the reasons for the reasons, her sources of anxiety.
Why am I worried?
Yes.
So that makes me worried. I mean, I also don't know. I mean, the Ukrainians are very confident about their ability to take back territory.
Yeah.
And they believe that's going to happen. And they can even tell you, off the record, where that will happen, they think first. But obviously there are a lot of unknowns, and I can't, you can't rely on. I mean, the best thing that could happen would be for them to do that quickly. And then we would get to the next, because you said something about we're being at the next phase of the war. We're not quite at the next phase.
Right.
So we're at the phase now where the Ukrainians are winning back territory, and they are reconquering land, and they're liberating, their territories, with actually, and every time it happens, there are these great scenes of people welcoming the soldiers, and there are, awful discoveries of horrible things that have happened, so you feel some sense of justice coming back. But what I don't know is how fast that can happen.
Right. So wait, in your view, what is the next phase then, if this is not quite the next phase?
So the next phase is when it becomes clear that either when the Ukrainians have taken back all the territory, as I said, at least since the February territory, or it's clear that they're going to.
Right. Ambassador, can I pose the same question to you? At this moment, what's the thing that gives you the most anxiety about the Ukrainian cause?
So first, if I may, I would like to beg your pardon because okay.
Yes. Okay. I am sorry for being late. My American Airlines was late.
We empathize.
So the plane was broken and I had to wait 2 hours. But thank you for being here. And I'm really sorry to have missed the beginning of what Anne said. What is the most worrying for the time being is what is happening. The next phase of the Russian aggression against the Ukrainian people, which is the systematic bombing to deprive the Ukrainian people of water and energy. I don't think it will work. The two first military attempts failed. I'm pretty sure this new attempt will fail too, and we will do everything to make it fail. This is the reason why the Ukrainian and French president decided to organize this conference in Paris on December 13th to support the Ukrainian resilience through the winter. But the mere fact that so many people are suffering again is in itself horrible, and so this is what gives hope is the resilience of these people. It's incredible courage, and so we must of course support it. And again, I think we will go through this, but there are so many victims, so many sufferings. It's more than worrying.
Little did you know that you were walking into a social experiment. As I asked both of you the same question, Anne's answer to the question was identical to yours, and
Okay.
she said that no. She said that she worried about attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure leading to political pressures, especially in Europe, to prematurely end the war. And I wonder if you see that happening.
No, because we on the contrary will support Ukraine. The fact that we discussed at a later stage, and when the Ukrainians themselves will be ready, a political settlement is important in another way to support also everybody's perspectives in our public opinions, also to support what President Zelensky himself has presented as a peace plan, and also to hold the ground in the world community, and not to give any pretext to the Russian propaganda, which says to the countries of the South that they are the ones who want negotiations. Well, they are exactly the contrary, the ones who continue to commit these crimes. So I don't see here, if it was your linkage, I don't see absolutely no pressure. It's on the contrary. It is I think it's very important also to maintain this perspective.
So, and you talked about this moment where Putin realizes that he's made a mistake, that he realizes
Him or someone.
But knowing what you know from studying this man for so long, I mean, you could objectively say we've passed this threshold moment where he should have recognized that he's made a mistake. What psychologically do you feel like will be is there a trigger? Is there a point at which that actually happens? Or is he at this stage proven himself somebody who is somehow immune from the possibility of admitting that he erred?
So it won't be a psychological trigger. It will be a physical change of facts on the ground. As I said, I imagine that Ukrainians taking back all the territory that they lost since February would be a large step in that direction. This experience of loss would then be clear. The Ukrainians believe that they have to take back Crimea as well. That I leave open. I don't know whether that's necessary or not, in the sense of being the thing that will stop the war. But I think at least getting, when all the territory is back, when it's clear that the invasion was, 100,000 Russians died for no reason, when it's clear that Russian prestige was lost and the Russian economy was destroyed or undermined, then it will become clearer to a lot of people in Moscow that it was a disaster. And we're still at the phase where the Russians are talking that, they use this language, the mobilization will help, we're going to buy more weapons. They're still, the mistake a lot of people in Washington and elsewhere still sometimes make is they think that Putin has dialed back his aims. Actually, in public, the aims of the war are unchanged. Yeah. The war is still about destroying Ukraine, undermining Ukraine, wiping Ukraine off the map. None of that language has changed, and so we need to hear that language change. And by the way, I should say another important thing about Putin is that because he controls all the levers of communication inside the country, he can decide when the language changes. In other words, he can tell whatever story he wants to the Russians. It's not really our problem. About why the war is stopped or why we're not doing it anymore, and he can even declare it a victory of some kind if he wants. But
why? When let's say we reach this moment, which seems more more plausible now than it did at the beginning of the summer that Ukraine recaptures all of this territory. Why would, given just how relentless Putin has been in pursuing this revanchist dream about restoring Ukraine to the motherland, given the way that he responded to 2014 and just kept going and going and going, why would he ever stop?
As I said, he and everybody around him and everybody in the country has to perceive this as a loss. The soldiers who were fighting there have to understand that it was a waste. They have to begin saying so. I mean, what we're waiting for is a kind of change in the political conversation in Moscow, and that hasn't really. It happens a little bit on the fringes, and people who do opinion polling more broadly in Russia, and there are ways to do it online and using technology and so on. They think that there's been a huge drop in. It wasn't ever really support for the war, but kind of indifference towards the war has changed into people feeling negative about the war, and when that begins to really plunge, then I think you'll begin to have a different conversation.
So, Ambassador, does that sound like the most likely scenario to you, that we'll only reach this point where diplomacy becomes possible, that the war's end can be in sight when Ukraine achieves this military victory where it takes back territory that it lost in February?
Well, after so many sufferings and so much courage and the success of the counteroffensive, of course, the situation is not the same as it would have been some months ago. So, and it's for them to decide when they are negotiating, but it is also for the Russians to decide when they want to, or when they accept to, as Anne said, that their operation, and for the Russian president in that case, to accept to consider it was a dramatic, a terrible mistake, a failure, and then to, as Anne said, to present the situation to his public opinion in such a way that the conditions can be created for reopening the negotiations. It is a fact that many Russian citizens, have we said, have voted with their feet and left the country, but probably mostly out from the big cities, from the bulk of the Russian population is, as Anne said, the information is controlled, and so it's
controlled. The narrative is controlled. I think people do have ways of getting information.
No, probably they see
they
understand things do not happen as they were told. Also, the effect of the mobilization, but still the narrative, yes, remains one and unique.
So Anne alluded also before you arrived about the visit and some things that were said that she thought were being said sotto voce about by President Macron about what the contours of negotiation would look like. And obviously there was a moment where President Macron got some stick for saying in an interview that we should begin thinking about security guarantees for Russia. And I know that that's complicated. Maybe Anne also said that it was more subtle than had been reported. But could you just help articulate and elaborate what he was getting at with that?
No, I think he said clearly we must continue to support the Ukrainians and also to adapt and increase our support through this new, terrible, cruel, very difficult phase for the Ukrainian population through the winter. And when he spoke about the guarantees, he didn't say, I can find the quote exactly in his interview to the French television, which was the guarantee for Russia. I think he said guarantee for the Europeans in general, including for Russia. So it's the idea which is not new. I don't know whether you remember what he and other leaders, including in the United States, proposed before the invasion, just also to let clear that the Russian president had all reasons not to invade if he didn't want to invade. So at one point we will come back to this idea. In between, crimes have been committed. So we do not forget in any way what has been committed in between, and for those responsible for those crimes have to be held accountable. And France was the first country to send forensic experts and DNA laboratories after Bucha. And this does not prevent us to do that. But on the other hand, there is no other solution if we want to end this war and to make this war, contrary to 2014, not repeatable, to prevent this war, a new war to break out at one point. We have we will have then, we are not there, of course, we will have then to create a situation where, and this is my understanding of the word guarantees, the relevant countries, and Ukraine is the first one among them, of course, feel secure, but also there is no reason to start this war. So guarantees of security is a concept which then will apply to all countries, as we tried before.
Do you have a reaction to that?
I mean, however, whatever we want to call it, whatever we want to call it, security architecture, security guarantees, or whatever the post-war world is going to look like, it has to be a world in which there are, 2 or 3 certainties. One of them is that there can't be another invasion of Ukraine. And so there have to be not just security assurances or whatever we gave Ukraine in the Budapest Memorandum, whose anniversary was, I think, yesterday or the day before. There can't be that. It has to be something, believable and palpable and real. In my view, the best thing would be to let Ukraine into NATO. It's already got the best army in Europe. It's already a Western ally. I don't know why we should pretend otherwise. But I understand that that's a conversation that hasn't really happened yet. The second thing, that there has to be some sense after the war is over, however it ends, there has to be some sense of justice, that there was some kind of justice done. And whether that means, case by case, the crimes of the Russians there are trials, there are hearings, there's a court in The Hague or Geneva or somewhere, or whether it means that the Russian leadership itself is put on trial.
Can we just pause on this, because it's come up a couple times, and I think it's such a fascinating question that I worry that the world is not paying enough attention to, which is for all of the resources that the French and the Americans and the Ukrainians themselves have devoted to investigating war crimes, documenting war crimes, the scale of the war crimes that have been committed probably exceeds the capacity of our collective efforts to document them. But I also wonder if our current system of international justice is actually equipped for dealing with this. I mean, what is the scenario in which, I guess this is what you're alluding to in which the leadership of Russia, let alone the perpetrators on the ground, are actually genuinely held to account?
Do you want to answer?
Well, there is already a conversation on this. The experts are discussing this, although the most important thing is to not to be late to collect testimonies on also proofs, but there is also in parallel a discussion. As you know, we have in Europe a strong belief in the legitimacy of the International Criminal Court to fight against impunity. Here in the US, for the reasons the US is not part of it, but this administration has also, I think, supported the investigations by the prosecutor of the ICC. So there are also discussions on a separate mechanism. As you're right to say that it would be difficult because of the amount of crimes and which have to be investigated. So we will have to find the best way to do it, and this is not yet decided, of course.
Just to underline something you said, I was in Ukraine last summer, and I was on the ground there was a town near Odessa where there had just been a strike that completely random people were killed in a town that was nowhere near any nowhere even near the war zone. And one of the things I encountered was there are now these teams of prosecutors from the Ukrainian prosecutor's office who have war crimes training, and they show up and they have checklists and they have things they know they're supposed to do, and they have forms to fill out. They know how to report it so that the material can be gathered and eventually organized in some way and presented at a court. So, you're right that the preparations for doing that have begun. So the kind of at the ground that's happening. I mean, but you're also right that the really difficult question is going to be the political one, because it's not just about, particular Russian soldiers who can be arrested and put on trial. I think that, it's going to be about the leadership of Russia and who made the decisions, to drop bombs on completely innocent civilians, and who made the decisions to torture people in torture chambers all over the occupied territories, because these aren't decisions being made by individual soldiers. And I don't know that the international community, or really it's not the international community we're talking about, Europe and the United States, are ready yet to say, we want to put the leaders of Russia on trial. But we will eventually confront that question.
I mean, it is a gap in the language that we use to discuss Russian atrocities, that when we look at something like Bucha and the mass graves and executions.
And there are now dozens of Buchas,
right.
Dozens, hundreds actually.
But they usually exist in a separate conversation from Mariupol or from the bombardment of Kyiv, where the attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure from afar. The clinical part of the Russian war is not classified in the same sort of genocidal sort of way that we tend to describe those atrocities on the ground. The other thing that I think you've both talked about briefly is reconstruction, and I'm especially interested. And I mean, you've spent so much time in Ukraine before the war. You're so attached to the country. It feels like an exciting opportunity on the other side to do something exhilarating, to create in some ways a new and different society, maybe liberated from oligarchy.
So the Ukrainians themselves are already talking about it. I was there for a longer period of time last summer, and I actually spent a couple of days I wanted to think about the future, and I talked to both people at the digital ministry, which is a very forward-thinking piece of the government. Everybody there is 25. And I talked to a couple of architects about how they were thinking about reconstruction. And you're exactly right. So people are thinking about how do we, rebuild the country in a way that's better and more humane. How do we change the way the economy works so that we're not dependent on whatever it was, the 6 or 7 oligarchs who ran so much of the business. I mean, as it happens, a lot of them have lost their business because many of those, that was what was in Mariupol, was large oligarch-controlled factories. And also how do we build on this sense of community and solidarity that we had during the war and make it something real so that it's a different kind of country afterwards. And people almost everybody who's involved in aid to Ukraine, whether it's sort of humanitarian aid or whether it's, I know a lot of people who've worked on democracy promotion in Ukraine in the past, almost everybody who thinks about it is already also talking in those terms. What do we do to make sure that there's no theft of reconstruction money? How do we structure the funds? How do we think about who to support and who not to support? There's an enormous amount of conversation. And as soon as we get to the point where we can have that conversation for real and where it's not very theoretical, I think there'll be a kind of explosion of enthusiasm and interest. I really do.
And if I may add, this will be absolutely essential when the time comes, that the reconstruction is not coming back to the country before the invasion, but is looking forward in the context of the decision taken by the EU leaders in June, 1 week after my president's visit to Kyiv, and together with the Romanian president and the German chancellor, and so under the French presidency, if I may say so, of the council. which is to decide that Ukraine will become a member of the European Union. So this is the context, and what Anne described is, and I hope this thinking will prevail then, is absolutely essential for the success of this future in the Europe and approximation to the European Union, and then in the European Union.
I mean, actually, the offer of European membership to Ukraine is really important in that context because, I mean, just as it was important for the Central Europeans 20 years ago, I mean, the idea that there is a thing that we can build to and there's a framework within which we can fit, that's going to be very, very important for the Ukrainian economy.
My sense is among the reformers on the ground in Ukraine, that's almost a necessary precondition for anything successful happening ultimately. I wonder, Ambassador, I just read a fascinating book by a German journalist called Harold Janner about the aftermath of the war in Germany. And one of the things that he wrote about was the way in which different cities dealt with rubble. And so Frankfurt very successfully dealt with all the rubble that was in the country by building, I mean, this is Anne's territory, by building a public-private partnership and finding a way to quickly rebuild. I wonder, just from your own country's history and your reading of history, what are the lessons about reconstruction that you think should be carried to the fore as we embark on this project?
Well, first, the use of the good use of foreign aid, which came in particular from the United States then, and also I think a clear vision of your priorities. The priorities for the future of your country. It is in particular what in our experience, President de Gaulle did when he founded the Fifth Republic, and this ensured what France is today. So, but when I mentioned the visit to Kiev in June, and I must not forget that also the president of the Italian Council was there. I mean, and all countries of the European Union have been there in Kiev on the side of President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian people. We want also that this reconstruction then will be a true partnership, not only something about a future in some years or about finances or even in financial support is essential. A true partnership to help to accompany the Ukrainians to rebuild their country as a free democratic country, a European country. So we will all be there and as members of the family.
The title of the conversation was originally Ukraine and the Future of Democracy. And it's interesting to consider the ways in which the war has changed us, has changed our publics, has changed some of the ways in which we've thought about our own economic future. And I can't help but be surprised by the way in which publics in Europe and the United States have basically not shifted significantly, it seems like, in their opinions about the war. And yet it feels like we're at a very vulnerable moment here where you have a Republican majority in the House, no matter how thin, that could actually obstruct aid to Ukraine.
I think there are a number of reasons for it. I mean, I agree with you that it's remarkable. One of the main reasons is really to do with Zelensky himself, and the way he and his government have explained Ukrainianness to the world. If in the United States we've had for a decade, we would have this kind of culture war between, I don't know, very in an unnuanced description, sort of liberal values on the one hand versus something like patriotism or nationalism on the other hand. Zelensky has done this kind of patriotic, nationalistic defense of liberal values. And he's shown that you can fight for democracy and you can die for democracy and you can really, really, really want democracy. And I think that's had an enormous effect, I think maybe even in unknown ways. I mean, I cannot prove it. I mean, there's no way I can prove that I can establish it, but the protests in Iran and in China, two other countries where seemingly immovable autocracies that can't be defeated have been challenged in recent weeks. I can't help but wonder if some of that isn't people seeing what the Ukrainians are doing and thinking, if they're brave enough to do it, we can do it too. So I mean, I think there's both in the settled democratic world, there's a kind of admiration for that kind of that defensive democracy, but also in the autocratic world, evidence that, first, that Russia wasn't as strong as we thought it was. This, again, this so-called, undefeatable army of the great autocratic central power turned out to be much weaker than we expected. I mean, people are going to draw lessons from that all over the world.
If I may come back to the support in our countries, both in the US and in Europe, of course, we must not be complacent, because we have to explain again to our people what happens. For the time being, I agree with the two of you. The support holds, even in the polls show some erosion. The last polls I've seen in the US, for instance. But I think even the political scene, he's holding the support, no doubt. There are three things to continue to explain. Also, to mitigate the effects in our countries. It is one of the reasons why it's so important to reform the energy policy in the European Union. But there are many other consequences, many things to do. And also the third thing, which we must stress, is we have another constituency beyond Europe, beyond the United States, and first beyond the battleground itself, which is the South, or which now I don't think it's a proper denomination. We call the global South.
They're often called in Washington the swing states.
Yes, exactly. But those are countries which some of them are democracies, some of them are not. But they are really also the place where there is a battle between narratives, influences, and this is also really important to continue or even to increase our efforts, because we now, after so many months, we understand where they are from, where they are, and from where they speak. So it is a reason why all the issues linked to the war, both the fact that it is not a European crisis, it's a global denial by Russia, one of the P5 members of all principles of international security, of the Charter of the United Nations, but also to treat the problems. This is a reason why we had to be so active on food security, and we are.
Can I ask you both? I mean, one of the things that the war has accelerated, perhaps, is the deglobalization of the world, and I know that this has created maybe a disagreement in the transatlantic alliance, where you have the Biden administration has begun to engage in industrial policy as it relates to semiconductors and energy manufacturing, and in some ways, it feels like this type of deglobalization is kind of a necessary response to the battle between democracy and autocracy, as the United States tries to escape its relationship or decouple with China. But do you see that type of deglobalization also as a threat ultimately to winning over some of these swing states, as Anne calls them?
Well, I would not formulate it exactly the same way, but I think that we have to be cautious when we shape the way we want the globalization to evolve. First, to preserve the transatlantic solidarity, which was the other. The synchronization, as my president said, the other big topic of his state visit, but also to take into account, indeed, the positions and the needs and the priorities of those other countries. I think that our countries are legitimate, not only the US but also Europe, in their will to reindustrialize.
Right.
based on the lessons we draw from COVID, but also the pandemics, but also from the competition with China and from the war, the invasion by Russia. So in the field of energy, for instance, so this is normal. Then we must it must be one of the most important topics of the transatlantic conversation, both between us, how we do it, supply chains and so on,
Right.
and also taking into account the other countries. This is important.
Have you thought about, Anne, kind of the security architecture, the economic alliances that will emerge from the world? And do you feel like the world might emerge from this war differently aligned?
So a word that is now in use, I'm actually not, I realize I'm not sure who invented it, so I can't give them credit, is now the expression friend shoring as opposed to offshoring. So, okay, global supply chains, okay, investment, but have those investments be with your friends and not with people who are going to weaponize those investments and use them against you. And, we're not anywhere close to that kind of world yet, but we may be heading in that direction. I mean, I think the Biden administration's decision to block certain kinds of exports to China that was made a few months ago was important, not just for its own sake, but also as a kind of signal to businesses around the world, especially in the United States, that this idea that you can trade anything with China, sell anything with China, is that world is slowly coming to an end. So start making different plans. Because we now know from experience from watching what's happened in Russia, from China as well, that to be over dependent on a country that wishes us ill or that seeks to undermine our democracy or wants to change our political system or might invade us is very risky.
Do you find some of your own ideological precepts have shifted under the course of events?
I'm not sure which ideological.
No, I don't know. I've never had a conversation with you about free trade, for instance, or about globalization.
So it's very interesting. I was recently rereading the arguments that people were making about China's entry into the WTO in the 1990s. I think it's 2000 actually is when the vote was held. And there were a lot of arguments back and forth about whether it's good for China or bad for China, whether China's a communist dictatorship and we shouldn't be trading. There are a lot of arguments. None of the arguments, none of them, were about how will this kind of trade affect our democracy, and will it undermine us, and will it create corruption in the United States? Or at least none that I've found. I mean, maybe I haven't looked hard enough yet, but certainly in the op-ed pages of the Washington Post, there wasn't that argument wasn't being made. And I have actually worried for a long time about that. That the idea that, of course I'm in favor of trade and commerce, and I want, the French to sell us a lot of wine, and I want to sell a lot of whiskey in France, and I want open borders practically, between America and Europe. But I do worry a lot about what's the long-term impact of trade with profoundly corrupt autocracies that then seek to corrupt us. And the more that we now know about the Russian political system, how did Putin come to power? It's very clear that he came to power through this process of stealing money, taking it out of Russia, laundering it in the West, and then bringing it back inside. And so the degree to which the Western financial system enabled this growth of kleptocracy has been clear for a long time, and it's the only way to. Well, we started it, we can end it.
So let's throw this open to questions from the room, or I think we have some coming online.
So we have 2 questions online, which you can repeat.
Yeah, I can repeat.
Is it necessary to create a special tribunal on the Ukrainian war? And I'll ask the second one. With the House of Representatives being now controlled by the GOP, are you worried about a potential decreased U.S. support to Ukraine?
So are we worried about a decrease in Republican support for the war in Ukraine?
So I'm somewhat worried, but not very worried. Actually, my husband, who's a member of the European Parliament, was here some weeks. He was just here, but also here some weeks ago, and met a lot of members of Congress, including from the far right, as well as the center and the left. And his impression, people kept saying to him over and over again, "Don't worry, don't worry. We support Ukraine." And I think there's still enough momentum even inside the Republican Party as it exists now.
Yeah. Mitch McConnell's kind of one of the unspoken heroes of the Ukraine war, right?
Yeah, no, Mitch McConnell has been very clear. I mean, there is clearly a part of the Republican Party very closely attached to the sort of Republican, entertainment industry, if you know, the sort of entertainment media complex that, including the Trump family, that opposes the war, is pro-Russian, uses Russian narratives, and would like to, would like to use that to gain support or to make people angry or something. So far, they're not the majority.
And I can say that the contacts we have having recently, including during the state visit, we were on the Capitol Hill. We had contact with both parties, and same conclusion. Same conclusion on the assurance that the support to Ukraine will continue, and questions about the European support, of course.
Right.
So we had this discussion in a direction of continuing our support. No doubt on this. We'll see, but
I'm more pessimistic, but
yes, but we'll see. Of course, we'll see in the following weeks and months. But it is what has been stated now, and
it feels to me like there are other things they're going to want to do first before attacking the war effort. But
it's there's this continual need to refinance the war, to keep refine, and especially as the weapon system, we're starting to exhaust our arsenals. We need to rebuild in certain ways. It feels like if you have this small faction that can veto things in the House, then why wouldn't, they're actually ideologically committed on this issue. It's not. So the other question was about a tribunal.
Yes.
What was?
A specific tribunal on the war in Ukraine.
Does there need to be a specific tribunal for the war in Ukraine?
We made an allusion to this conversation, including between legal experts. There are some advantages not to create something new, which will take time and so on, while we have something which exists. There are some other advantages to have a specific instrument. I am not myself an expert, but I understand the experts are discussing this, of course.
Yeah, I would probably prefer that to the ICC, because you could, I think that these tribunals are often better done more spontaneously and outside of a bureaucracy. But that's a question that I could go either way.
Any questions in the room? Yes.
Yeah, I noticed, Marie-Jordan at the Atlantic Council. I noticed at the beginning of the war, in the first few months, a lot of the talk transatlantically was about the risk of escalations, either horizontally, like going to Moldova, we've seen recently potentially Poland, or vertically with potential use of nuclear weapon by Russia. Lately, I feel this is not at the top of the conversation. Maybe it's just an impression, and so I would like to hear from you. What is your level of concern regarding escalation, especially as Ukrainians are taking back territories? And was it in the state visit discussed between the two presidents in that specific this specific concern of escalation? Especially because in the way that Vladimir Putin said that some territories were now Russian and they've been retaken by Ukraine, and so.
Let me just repeat it for the sake of the internet. The question is, anxiety about escalation of the war seems to have abated, and the question is why, right? Ultimately, and was this discussed on the state visit?
The Russians have escalated. So the assault on Ukrainian infrastructure is an escalation from before. And one of the things actually that worries me a little bit about the endless nuclear conversation is that, oh, what a relief. The Russians have only taken out, the electric power plants. They haven't used nuclear weapons. There's a way in which, because the Russians keep talking about nuclear weapons, which of course they do to deter us, we somehow feel relieved that, oh, they're only, murdering people in different ways. So there has been that form of escalation. I mean, I still wouldn't rule out the possibility of the war spreading. It's a little bit less likely than before because, as the Russians begin to lose, the likelihood of them also wanting to invade extra countries seems more improbable. I mean, if they can't take over Ukraine, then why would they be able to take over Poland? So that's going to. I mean, the nuclear threat. Again, they talk about it a lot. And they do it to prevent us from arming Ukraine, and they do it to prevent us from, they do it in order to keep some cap on what we sort of will allow the Ukrainians to do with our weapons and how far they'll go. But on the other hand, it's a number of things that they had implied in the past would provoke or lead to nuclear reaction, including the invasion of Crimea, the destruction of the bridge. Some attacks on Russian infrastructure, or Russian military bases haven't produced that reaction. People are less afraid than they were. It doesn't feel like they're trigger happy in that direction, and they now seem also sufficiently deterred by us. So, yeah, that's my guess right now is that because the Russians are losing, people are less worried.
Now I have to answer about what was discussed during the state visit. No, what has been surely discussed is something which was not asked, but which is very, very crucial for the security and nuclear security. It's the security of the nuclear plants. And it is a crucial part of one of the big threats posed by the Russian aggression. And this is one of the most important efforts of our president, together with the DG of the International Agency for Atomic Energy in Vienna, Grossi, because the danger is looming. The threat, sorry, not the danger, but the threat is there, with bombings of not only Zaporizhia, but other Ukrainian infrastructures, because some of them are nuclear facilities. So since our president has made these big efforts, especially on Zaporizhia, yes, this is one of the many aspects of the crisis which has been discussed, of course, because it remains something we have to discuss.
Yeah. My sense is also that when we began the war, the United States, maybe the Allies, didn't have a real theory about Russian escalation, about what would trigger Russian escalation. And so there's been all this lived experience now about what the Russians will do in response to the delivery of certain weapon systems. And also, I suspect within the Pentagon administration, there's a lot of thinking that's been done about how you would deter Russia from, say, using a tactical nuclear weapon. And therefore, the conversations that we've had with the Russians on that account, on that front, have probably been more effective, very specific, and that's probably helped that disappear.
Yeah, so we know there have been very specific conversations about that directly with the Russians. Here's what we will do. I don't know that it's, in great detail, but they've been told multiple times that there will be a very strong response.
Right.
So,
any other questions in the room? Yes.
Just a comment, not a question. First of all, Ambassador, thank you very much for organizing this discussion, which was very, very interesting. I'm Yaroslav Brysuk, I'm at the Ukrainian Embassy in Washington. On the subject of continuation of war, our goal is complete victory, and that's the only viable option that we consider. And we hope that this objective will be shared by all our partners, that Ukraine's victory in the field of Russia, the country, the aggressor state that flouted the most fundamental norms of international law, cannot go unpunished. Our people are determined to fight, and President Zelensky stated clearly that the prerequisite for any peace negotiations is complete liberation of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea at the end. And we need a closure to this war, an end of war, and holding the perpetrators accountable. On the subject of the tribunal that was discussed also, this is our position, that we need a special tribunal, not only to hold accountable the perpetrators on the ground, the soldiers who did the war crimes and killings, but to hold the Russian leadership accountable for the crime of aggression, which is the mother of all crimes and the source of all further war crimes that happened after that. And of course, on the subject of security guarantee, I completely agree with you. Our position is that the only viable option and guarantee is Ukraine's membership in NATO, because we saw the alternative solutions with Budapest Memorandum and security assurances after Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world. They simply don't work. So this is our goal. We continue moving towards it, and we hope it happens after our victory. Thank you for your support.
Thank you. I just received a message that I was supposed to repeat the question or repeat the statement, but I don't think I could do that nearly as eloquently as you just delivered it. So I don't know if either of you have anything to say in response.
What do you mean?
Thank you for being here first. We are neighbors. You've seen the Ukrainian center facing our residence, and it was we respect very much the fight of your people and your country.
And I would just say that I think it's important to talk about NATO membership now, even as it seems like a far away, mystical, impossible thing. But it's important to mention it and talk about it as a realistic idea as much as we can.
Do we have any last questions here? Yes.
I would have a question. I'm from the Romanian Embassy, Chancellor Marius Florescu. You know, the title of the event is related to the democracy in Ukraine.
Yeah.
You know, with so many people, you know, refugees in Europe and so many people displaced in Ukraine, how do you perceive for the state of democracy when if Ukraine hopefully come back to normal times?
Right. So thank you. We would have been remiss if we didn't address the refugee question. And the question that's been posed is, you know, how do we need to address the refugee crisis problem both within Ukraine, and I guess you're also asking probably within the countries where they've migrated to. Is there some policy that we need for the long term that has implications both for resettlement and for democracy?
I think for people to express their opinion, their voice,
Right.
I'm not entirely sure I understood the question. I mean, the best solution to the refugee crisis is for the war to end.
Yeah.
And when the war ends, people will go home. I mean, there will be some people who won't go home.
Can I just in Poland, which is actually home for you, is one of your homes. Do you feel like the welcome is starting to wear out at all for refugees?
So I've just seen some polling that says yes.
Yeah.
I mean, mostly it's not opposition to the war. It's not resentment of sanctions, anything like that. There is, because Poland is itself having an economic crisis, which has other causes.
Yeah.
It has very, very high inflation, kind of collapse of the healthcare and school system. There's anxiety about the role, the feeling that the Ukrainians get social services before we do is now a kind of myth that's current among a lot of Poles. And some of that could be solved. That's a particularly Polish problem. It doesn't mean that people aren't still pro-Ukraine, or aren't still welcoming towards particular Ukrainian refugees. But there is a sense of loss. But it's really related to the very dire economic problem.
Do you have friends who are still housing Ukrainian refugees in Poland?
Yes, I do. I had some until about 2 months ago. And then they went back. They were there from February, March until October. So,
just one remark on the refugees. It's one thing we have always to underline here in the United States when the U.S. In the U.S. some voices say the Europeans should do more.
Yeah,
we say two things because beyond the figures, first the refugees, and which is a specificity of Europe because of the geography, and also the economic consequences in Europe, which is much bigger than in the US. In the American debate, it's important to underline those two contributions of Europe. And of course, I guess our Ukrainian colleague can say it, but those populations, I'm sure they want to come back as soon as possible. And it's a part of the future of your country because we have so many children and women. It's an incredible success in a way.
How many Ukrainians are in France?
We have 100,000 now, I think. I don't know whether Baudouin or Pascal can give us a figure. 100,000 and tens of thousands in our schools, but most of them try to remain close the closest possible, I guess, to Ukraine, to come back to Ukraine as soon as possible. So we want to continue this success story, but of course it has consequences for the countries, for the people, and also financially it's a great I say it always to the people I meet here, it's also an effort for everybody in Europe, so and for the EU budget, so we see this as a contribution of our populations and our European Union, but also something which has to be really handled together with Ukraine as a part of Ukraine which we host and which will be part of the future of Ukraine.
Right, and underlines the necessity of making a substantial enough investment in reconstruction of Ukraine that you have an economy and you have a society that for people who long
to go back to.
that people who long to return to the homelands can feel optimistic about returning to. So thank you, Ambassador, for hosting.
Thank you for being here, and sorry again for being late. I'm so ashamed in my own house.
Thank you. No, thank you very much.
And thank you all.
And thank you. We got it. We made it.
Because we planned this for a long time, and it kept not happening. Polish ambassador.